The humid summer air of the stone house in Houston clung to the surface of the entryway floor, where the deep cracks in the foundation radiated a persistent damp chill that seeped into the soles of Ursula Vance's bare feet. She stood completely motionless in the center of the hallway, her body positioned with a rigid, unnatural verticality designed to protect the fragile, healing line of her abdominal incision from the sudden jarring movements of her infant daughter. Una, only 12 days old, emitted a high-frequency, piercing sound that vibrated directly against the cartilage of Ursula's collarbone. This sensory assault intensified the sharp, throbbing pressure behind her eyelids after weeks of interrupted sleep. Her right hand remained firmly cupped against the back of the infant's neck, feeling the rapid, erratic rhythm of the child's pulse under the soft, thin skin. The left hand was pressed firmly against the heavy fabric of her loose sweatpants, providing a layer of mechanical support to the deep internal stitches that felt as though they might pull apart with every shallow intake of breath. The surrounding atmosphere was heavy and motionless, filled with the stale scent of partially dried formula and the overwhelming artificial aroma of industrial citrus-scented cleaning fluid that Ursula had scrubbed into the entryway earlier that evening. The early morning light from the kitchen remained a distant, non-existent memory, leaving the house in a state of suspended, suffocating darkness. This dark environment was periodically illuminated by the frantic changing colors of the television screen in the living room, where the news broadcast played on an endless loop. Every muscle in Ursula's lower back ached with a dull, persistent intensity. This physical feedback loop was caused by the repetitive, hours-long cycle of rocking, feeding, and shifting weight to avoid compressing the sensitive tissue of her recovering body. She kept her eyes fixed on the precise spot where the hardwood floor met the baseboard, watching a single microscopic speck of dust drift through the air in the path of the television light. Her entire physical state characterized by a state of extreme, managed fatigue. She could feel the individual fibers of her worn aviation maintenance shirt scratching against the hypersensitive surface of her skin, each movement creating a subtle grating friction that served as a constant reminder of the physical cost of her current existence. The house itself felt alive with an oppressive, heavy stillness, where the only movement was the rhythmic, almost mechanical expansion of her own ribcage and the sharp, gasping cries of the child, who seemed trapped in a cycle of immediate, unceasing demand for attention. Ursula analyzed the structural reality of her marriage with the same cold, detached precision she employed when auditing technical maintenance logs at the regional aviation hub. Within her mind, she cataloged the behaviors of Xander as a series of predictable, recurring system failures, each one meticulously designed to maintain his own comfort at the expense of the stability of their shared environment. He possessed an uncanny, almost mathematical ability to identify the precise moment of her maximum vulnerability, such as this early hour when her physical endurance was at its absolute minimum. His decision to depart for a luxury trip to the Maldives with his social circle was not an impulsive error, but a calculated tactical maneuver intended to remove himself from the immediate chaotic requirements of newborn care. She understood that his refusal to consider her post-surgical limitations was not a failure of empathy, but a deliberate validation of his belief that his own temporal needs surpassed the survival requirements of his own family unit. Ursula mentally mapped the legal landscape of their property, acknowledging that the stone house in Houston was purchased long before their union, using an inheritance from her mother, and the accumulated savings from her years of service as a Senior Aviation Maintenance Quality Auditor. Under the separate property rights defined by the laws of the state of Texas, This dwelling was not a shared marital asset, yet Xavier acted with the casual entitlement of an owner, suggesting that his own financial comfort was a direct product of her professional success. She felt no surge of anger, only a chilling diagnostic clarity as she realized that her professional competence was being systematically utilized against her. He had constructed a domestic narrative where she was the invincible, efficient machine of the household, a label that excused him from providing support, while simultaneously rendering her invisible to the very system he was exploiting for his own benefit. The betrayal was not a singular event, but a continuous systemic degradation of her agency that had been masked behind the polite, public-facing rituals of a successful upper-middle-class marriage. The sharp, sudden sound of Xavier dragging his heavy polycarbonate suitcase across the hardwood floor created a harsh, discordant frequency that seemed to slice through the already frantic crying of the infant. He walked toward the front entrance with an easy, fluid grace, his linen shirt crisp and unwrinkled, his new sunglasses dangling from the collar of his shirt as if he were preparing to step onto a private deck rather than an airport shuttle. When Ursula asked him to postpone his departure by even 7 days to allow her incision to begin the final stage of cellular knitting, Xavier did not look at her, but instead focused intently on the glow of his cellular device. He spoke in a flat, monotone register that was completely devoid of emotional inflection, explaining that the non-refundable nature of his airline booking rendered any modification to his schedule a financial impossibility. When she pressed him again, his tone hardened, and he reminded her that she had successfully managed complex logistics and emergency maintenance operations in high-stress environments, implying that the care of a single infant was an inferior challenge in comparison. He leaned down, touching 2 fingers to the forehead of the child in a performative gesture that looked as though it were being enacted for the benefit of a hidden camera, an artificial demonstration of paternal care that failed to disguise the lack of any authentic connection. Ursula felt a somatic reaction in her own chest, a tightening of the muscles around her solar plexus that made it difficult to maintain the necessary posture to support Una. She wanted to detail the physiological reality of the surgery, to explain the exact mechanics of the internal healing process, and to demonstrate that her professional history in aviation maintenance did not grant her a biological immunity to the requirements of physical recovery. Instead, she remained silent, watching the cold, distant expression on his face as he continued to prioritize his travel itinerary over the clear medical distress signals emanating from his own daughter. The contrast between his polished outward appearance and the internal chaos of her own recovery was absolute, a disparity that was becoming impossible to reconcile with any sense of shared marital purpose or mutual commitment. The rideshare vehicle pulled away from the curb at 4:47 in the morning, the harsh white light of the departing taillights cutting through the lingering darkness of the neighborhood and leaving the front yard in a sudden, unsettling gloom. Ursula stood by the threshold of the open door, watching the vehicle accelerate down the street until the glow of its lights vanished entirely, leaving behind only the deep, silent void of the Texas night. The immediate, jarring transition from the possibility of his presence to the finality of his departure triggered a sudden, uncontrollable surge of physical exhaustion that almost collapsed her knees. Una, sensing the sudden change in rhythm, began to cough and choke, finally spitting a warm, viscous stream of formula down the front of Ursula's shirt, the liquid soaking quickly through the fabric to reach the tender, inflamed skin of her surgical site. The sharp, burning pain flared instantly, but she did not cry out, instead performing the necessary, practiced movements to keep the child upright, her hands working on automatic pilot to restore the fragile equilibrium of their environment. She turned back into the hallway, the sound of the house settling into an oppressive silence that felt much heavier than it had before he left. She retreated into the quiet, dark space of the nursery, where the only movement was the soft, mechanical swinging of the bassinet, and the only sound was the shallow, breathless rhythm of her own labored breathing. Every piece of furniture in the house seemed to cast a long, accusing shadow, and the air felt thick with the weight of the tasks she would now have to complete without a single moment of pause or professional assistance. She sat down in the nursing recliner, the chair making a soft, compressed groan under her weight, and she began the process of feeding, changing, and soothing the child once again. Her movements stripped of any excess motion. Her focus narrowed to the immediate biological requirements of the life she held in her arms. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, a massive, unyielding space that marked the total termination of her domestic expectations and the beginning of a cold, solitary audit of her own existence. Ursula waited for the sun to rise, her eyes tracking the slow, imperceptible change in the color of the room, from deep charcoal to a thin, sickly shade of gray. Outside, the neighborhood remained entirely still, the nocturnal insects having ceased their chirping, leaving the environment in a state of total, featureless anticipation. She looked out toward the window, her gaze passing through the glass to the silhouette of the old oak trees that stood like silent sentinels against the horizon. The sharp light of the morning sun began to creep over the roof of the adjacent property, the pale golden rays hitting the edge of the curtains, and slowly, inevitably, filling the room with a cold, unforgiving illumination. She stood up slowly, her body feeling brittle, and walked to the nursery window, resting her forehead against the glass. The air on the other side of the pane was already heating up, the promise of a long, punishing day ahead, reflected in the relentless clarity of the rising sun. She did not look at the phone on the bassinet table, nor did she reach for it. Her attention focused entirely on the empty street below and the quiet, structured order of the world that she would now have to navigate alone. The house around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first sound of the new, solitary order she would construct from the wreckage of the last 12 days. There was no sound left to make, and no one remaining to hear it. The faint yellow glow from the nursery nightlight cast a weak warmth across the dark walnut wood of the dining table, where a thin layer of dust settled over Ursula Vance's fingertips as she pressed her right palm flat against the cool surface. Her 29-year-old body remained completely rigid, sitting on the edge of the wooden chair, while her left hand rhythmically adjusted the hard plastic pump shield against her breast, feeling the dull electric pulse of the machine send a uniform vibration through her collarbone. The internal temperature of the room fluctuated around 24 degrees Celsius, but the air felt heavy, carrying the sour smell of spilled formula mixed with the dry metallic scent of the electronic terminal warming up beside her laptop. A sharp, stinging throb continued to hum directly beneath her surgical dress, where the vertical line of her 12-day-old incision reacted to every heavy breath she took in the silence. From the portable bassinet near the wall, Una's shallow, sleeping gasps marked the time, accompanied by the slow, heavy drag of her mother-in-law's right foot moving across the kitchen linoleum down the hall. Xander moved with an agonizing slowness, the mechanical friction of her arthritic hip joint creating a dull clicking noise that broke the midnight quiet at steady intervals. Ursula did not turn her head to watch her. Her eyes remained fixed on the white digital spreadsheet illuminating her face, her respiration entirely regular as she controlled the physical feedback of her exhaustion. Through the open door, the shadow of the older woman lengthened across the hallway carpet, a giant, distorted shape shifting under the low-wattage bulb of the overhead fixture. The rhythmic click hiss of the mechanical breast pump provided a baseline drone inside the small nursery room, completely absorbing the minor creaks of the settling house walls. Ursula slowly extended her index finger, tracing the lower edge of the computer trackpad. Her muscle movement decelerated to prevent any sharp plastic noise that might alert the presence in the hallway. This domestic fortress had become a technical processing zone where Ursula evaluated the risk coefficients of her economic survival with the cold logic of a senior aviation quality auditor. Her mind separated the immediate physical variables from the deep financial irregularities appearing within the household ledger, translating Xavier's sudden international silence into an active adversarial maneuver. The rejection of the joint debit card on loop 1604 during a desperate run for medical supplies had confirmed her initial diagnostic fears regarding his transactional behavior. A total sum of exactly $18,000 had been systematically siphoned from their emergency savings account, an extraction that left their primary household engine completely dry while she recovered from surgery. She did not allow her internal systems to trigger a standard emotional panic response. Instead, her logistics training allowed her to map this structural betrayal as a series of calculated steps designed to compromise her defense. She understood that Xavier had treated her recovery period as a window of non-regulation, assuming that the physical constraints of caring for a newborn would prevent her from executing a baseline audit of his administrative movements. Her focus narrowed to the digital path left by his unauthorized access, recognizing that the missing $18,000 was merely a primary indicator of a much larger structural threat aimed directly at her personal real estate holdings. The presence of Xander in the house was another high-risk variable, designed to apply psychological leverage, forcing a compromise before the complete scale of the extraction could be uncovered by formal investigation. Ursula adjusted the screen brightness down to 10%, her internal calculations mapping the exact statutory path required to establish a clean evidentiary record for the federal authorities. The slow, dragging footsteps grew louder as Xander entered the dining space. Her frame bent slightly forward as she deposited a heavy stack of legal papers onto the table, with stiff, trembling fingers. She adjusted her reading glasses, her breathing heavy as she looked at the bright matrix on the laptop, before asking in a low, gravelly voice if Ursula was ready to sign the temporary family allowance agreement. Ursula kept her voice entirely level, explaining that her professional evaluation of the document revealed an absolute forfeiture of her separate property rights under the Texas Family Code. She detailed the exact technical metrics of the text, showing that the proposed monthly stipend of $2,000 was contingent upon granting Xavier full administrative access to her independent aviation legacy accounts. Leaned against the back of the chair, her jaw tightening as her knuckles turned a pale color against the dark wood, her body exhibiting a clear somatic response to the refusal. She muttered that a good wife must trust the family management during a transition period rather than hiding behind clinical parameters and corporate auditing rules while her husband was arranging business connections overseas. Ursula did not blink her eyes, remaining locked on the older woman's face as she stated that a raw extraction of $18,000 without administrative consent did not constitute family management. She explained that the system logs already showed the transaction routing numbers originating from an international node, indicating a deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. Aria's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements, her fingers gripping the edge of the paper stack as the cold, technical clarity of Ursula's presentation stripped away her maternal authority. The discovery of the primary forgery occurred at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, after Uria had retreated back down the dark hallway, leaving the room in total isolation. Ursula initiated a deep administrative search through the Public Records Index of Harris County, using her secure digital signature to access the property deed archives under the Public Information Act. Her index finger depressed the master enter key, executing a retrieval script that unburied a recently filed electronic record titled General Power of Attorney. The document contained a fraudulent digital authorization block bearing a pixelated copy of her signature that had been systematically mapped onto the ledger page from an old aviation certification sheet. The corporate file established a fraudulent transaction structure where Xander claimed the legal right to execute an operational over-invoicing loop on her separate real estate asset. The contract details showed that he had created a fixed monthly service fee agreement of $24,000 multiplied by 12 months, establishing a total fake obligation of $288,000. This massive financial trap was engineered to place her separate property into an immediate technical default status, allowing a corporate shell entity controlled by Xander to seize the deed. The system metadata indicated that the electronic authorization had been processed using a compromised general power of attorney file to bypass the standard county verification protocols during her hospital stay. Ursula's jaw locked in a flat line of technical certainty as she recorded the exact cryptographic timestamps, confirming that the fraud crossed the state line threshold, elevating the offense to a major federal wire fraud violation. The terminal display settled into an inactive cold blue coloration as the automated audit protocol completed its verification sequence, confirming the absolute validity of the cryptographic chain of custody. The quiet that filled the dining room was now massive and heavy, uninterrupted by the sound of the pump machine, which had completed its timed cycle, leaving the space completely motionless under the dim yellow light. Outside the window, the heavy Texas mist hung low over the industrial transport corridors of Houston, the dark landscape completely silent as the city waited for the first break of dawn. Ursula slowly closed the primary interface casing of her laptop, the click of the latch providing a definitive physical punctuation to her midnight investigation. She looked down at the sleeping form of Una in the bassinet, her breathing regular and calm, entirely insulated from the financial warfare playing out across the digital network. Every piece of equipment in the room seemed to return to a state of clinical stasis, and the air grew cool as the central air conditioning unit completed its cycle. Ursula stood up slowly from the wooden chair, her body feeling stable as she placed the secure storage drive containing the audited metadata logs deep inside her pocket. There was no remaining doubt in her calculations. She had successfully established an indestructible chain of evidence that would completely dismantle Xavier's fantasy of ownership before the system could enforce his fraudulent parameters. The cold aluminum edge of the laboratory table pressed continuously against the small of Ursula Vance's lower back, sending a dull, localized ache straight up through her spinal cord. Her right forearm lay perfectly flat on the steel surface, her fingers maintaining a static 45-degree position over the tracking console for 2 consecutive hours without a single break. The ambient air inside the subterranean logistics audit annex of Randolph Air Force Base was kept at an uncomfortably chilly 18 degrees Celsius, yet the faint biting draft from the ceiling vents carried the dry mechanical scent of ozone and freshly printed material ledger sheets. A persistent rhythmic throbbing centered directly behind her left ear. This was a physical reaction to 72 hours of tracking supply databases under the harsh blue spectrum glare of the triple monitor terminal. Her left arm moved with absolute, calculated slowness, her fingertips dragging over the coarse texture of the steel desk to trace the physical boundaries of her digital folders. Through the reinforced security window of the secure annex, the vast San Antonio airfield landscape lay wrapped in absolute winter darkness, the heavy silence only broken by the distant, low-frequency hum of a transport aircraft idling on the nearby runway tarmac. Ursula did not blink. Her eyes remained locked on the terminal display, where the glowing blue interface lines cast a cold, mathematical reflection across her cheekbones. Her breathing completely leveled as she slowly slid her master military authentication card into the slot of the external reader. The click of the security latch echoed sharply against the bare concrete walls of the workspace, providing a physical baseline in the dark room. Her right knee shifted slightly forward by 2 inches, adjusting the angle of her pelvis to relieve the persistent stinging tension generated by her 12-day-old surgical incision. She maintained her fixed focus on the data interface, her upper body completely steady, while the primary cooling fans of the server mainframe generated a low, continuous hum that absorbed all secondary environmental frequencies. This technical fortress served as the perfect clinical screen to insulate her from the deceptive domestic narrative that Xavier Xander had constructed inside their home. Ursula Vance evaluated the systemic betrayal with the detached precision of an aerospace quality auditor, stripping away the emotional weight of her ruined marriage to focus purely on the forensic data points. Her family law attorney had been exceptionally clear during their brief meeting, stating that she must not confront her husband until she possessed an airtight, audited chain of custody that could survive a federal defense challenge. Any premature exposure of her suspicion would simply allow Xavier to deploy his polished public relations defense. He would utilize his social standing and his friendly reputation to paint her as unstable. He had spent months constructing a flawless public mask, but his financial movements left a distinct electronic footprint that he lacked the technical expertise to fully conceal. Ursula calculated the operational risks of his fraud, realizing that the house she had bought before marriage was being systematically targeted to fund an external entity under his direct control. The psychological pressure of keeping her discovery hidden while sharing a space with him was immense, but her military quality audit training allowed her to keep her somatic responses entirely flat. She understood that the deceptive signatures and the over-invoiced receipts were not simple administrative errors. They were the deliberate mechanics of an economic siege designed to strip her of her financial independence and keep her legally bound to his family liabilities. The verification parameters she was currently establishing would serve as an unyielding firewall, preventing any future manipulation of her legacy assets, while providing the federal authorities with a complete transaction map. Her internal logic remained perfectly clear as she processed the variables of the upcoming confrontation, knowing that a single administrative error on her part could jeopardize the safety of her infant daughter, Una. Clara Vance picked up the secure office telephone receiver, establishing an encrypted voice connection to federal investigator Ulysses Vance at his headquarters to lay out the technical parameters of the discovery. She stated that the processing of the logistics data confirmed that Xavier Xander was attempting to circumvent the property laws of the state of Texas by creating a fraudulent administrative overlay. She detailed that the digital ledger showed he had worked with an outside source to design a fake contract that would automatically pull assets from her estate without a standard title search. Ulysses Vance listened to the entire description through the encrypted line, his breathing maintaining a uniform rhythm, before he advised Ursula to stay inside the computer logs and avoid any text communication with Xavier. Ursula responded that the tracking system was already tracing the origin of the digital signature. Her tongue pressed against the back of her front teeth to stabilize her voice as she outlined the next technical tracking steps. She explained that she had deployed a specialized forensic document ledger analysis script to verify the exact internet protocol addresses used to access the mortgage platform. Ulysses stated that if the audit could confirm that the digital authorization occurred while Xavier was physically located outside the United States, the defense would have no legal ground to claim that she had authorized the transaction. Ursula nodded once into the dark room, her fingers tightening slightly around the telephone's plastic casing, as she affirmed that the security logs would be finalized before dawn. The dialogue continued for 20 minutes, each word spoken with a cold, legal precision that mapped out the statutory boundaries of the federal case file. Her voice held a flat, diagnostic tone that matched the mechanical hum of the server banks, completely devoid of the exhaustion that threatened to pull at her physical posture. The database screen refreshed, displaying the complete transactional ledger of the corporate mortgage application that Xavier had submitted to the regional lender. Ursula focused her attention on the billing codes, her voice quiet but flat as she read the digital receipts line by line into her private recording microphone. Xavier had utilized his administrative access to generate 12 separate, highly inflated maintenance invoices for security system upgrades that never occurred. The billing structure was a classic example of operational over-invoicing, where the service cost of $24,000 was charged monthly against her separate property for 12 consecutive months. This systematic extraction generated a total loss of exactly $288,000, a massive financial drain that moved directly through the nonprofit front. The system logs showed that the funds did not remain within the primary accounts. Instead, they were routed through electronic wire transfers directly into a private account held by her brother-in-law, Xander. This interstate movement of stolen assets officially pushed the fraud past the federal threshold, elevating the local offense to a high-severity federal wire fraud violation under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code. Ursula felt her jaw muscles tighten as she documented the specific routing transit numbers, her body experiencing a cold spike of adrenaline that she immediately pushed down through sheer breathing control. She knew that the internal systems held absolute authority to audit transactions acting as fraudulent inducements, and this technical evidence would serve as the primary legal anchor to sink the Xander family assets. The automated script finished compiling the transaction matrix, mapping the flow of the $288,000 with absolute legal certainty. The final system log settled into an inactive, blue-tinted display of inactive codes, signaling the complete sealing of the technical perimeter around the Xander household. The ambient noise within the logistics annex returned to the low, uniform whisper of the server cooling fans, the high-capacity processors slowly dropping their thermal output as the audit concluded. Outside the double-pane safety window, the first faint light of dawn was beginning to trace the cold gray silhouette of the airfield water towers against the Houston horizon. The summer mist had transitioned into a silent, heavy humidity that clung to the military vehicles parked along the gravel perimeter of the base compound. Ursula Vance stood up from her metal desk with deliberate care, her movements slow and measured as she gathered her security drives and placed them inside her jacket pocket. Her fingers felt cold, but her breathing was entirely calm. The technical structure of her plan providing a profound, unyielding sense of certainty. There was no remaining doubt in her mind. She had established an indestructible digital chain of custody that would survive any legal challenge Xavier's family could mount. She stepped toward the heavy security door, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the concrete floor as she walked out of the silent annex into the chilly morning air, leaving the dark machines behind to run their quiet, targeted programs. The vast sky above the tarmac expanded in a pale silver sheet, completely devoid of clouds or movement, marking the absolute establishment of her strategic boundary. Her jaw remained set in a firm line as she walked toward her vehicle, her presence completely independent of the domestic trap she had just dismantled. The sharp, early morning Texas sun cut directly through the unwashed pane of the kitchen window, casting a long, geometric grid of pale amber light across the cold slate tiles of the floor panels. Ursula Vance stood perfectly still beside the dark oak counter, her right palm resting flat against the cool, polished stone surface, feeling the subtle, rhythmic vibration of the refrigerator motor hum through her fingertips. The internal temperature of the large kitchen was kept at exactly 21 degrees Celsius, yet a thin, freezing draft from the hallway doorframe curled around her bare ankles, making the skin on her calves prickle with tiny goosebumps. A sharp, stinging sensation persisted continuously along the lower boundary of her left abdomen, where the vertical line of her 12-day-old surgical incision reacted to every heavy breath she drew in the stillness. The air inside the room carried the rich, cloying aroma of fresh, dark roast coffee grinds, but it was heavily undercut by the dry chemical scent of lemon floor wax that Xavier Xander had applied to mask the deep scuff marks from his suitcase wheels. Ursula Xander sat exactly 4 feet away at the maple breakfast table, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a heavy mug, her chest moving in a slow, shallow pattern as she prepared to deliver another lecture on family loyalty. Ursula did not break her gaze from the older woman's face, her eyes tracking the slight downward curve of her mouth as the bright sun illuminated the fine silver strands of hair near her temples. The ambient space carried no sound except the low, monotonous hum of an external air conditioning unit working outside the brick wall, dropping the moisture level of the house down to 40%. Xavier stood by the pantry door, his posture radiating a casual alpha arrogance as he adjusted the collar of his new linen shirt, his fingers tapping a fast rhythm against the painted wood while he smirked at the digital display of his telephone interface. Ursula moved her right index finger a mere 2 millimeters along the smooth edge of her hidden device, tracking the microscopic settlement of dust on the screen, while her ears registered the distant hollow echo of an aircraft climbing over the distant flight path. This calm, domestic scene was the calculated screen Xavier used to mask the structural rot of his financial choices. But Ursula evaluated his posture with the icy, detached logic of an aviation maintenance quality auditor. Her mind functioned like a forensic document ledger, systematically cataloging Xavier's micro-expressions and weighing them against the technical risk variables she had established during her late-night network analysis inside the base annex. She knew that behind his comfortable, sun-tanned appearance lay a massive systemic collapse built entirely on unauthorized access and digital forgery that was now heavily compromised by active system logs. Xavier had arrived from the Maldives with the specific intent of enforcing an administrative blackout, pretending that a husband's international travel was merely a routine consulting deployment, rather than an absolute operational failure designed to strip her assets. Her inner logic reprocessed the household database entries with unyielding precision, calculating the exact statutory weight of the fraud Xavier had executed while she was incapacitated by surgery. She did not feel the typical panic of a spouse facing domestic betrayal. Instead, her logistics training allowed her to categorize his smirks as predictable noise within a failing apparatus that was about to experience a terminal judicial correction. She watched the older woman take a slow, deliberate breath, her own internal system remaining entirely flat as she waited for the primary electronic intercept to populate the synchronization columns on her portable terminal. The risk parameters were perfectly defined, and she knew that the federal guidelines would treat any unauthorized deletion of these server logs not as a civil dispute, but as an active obstruction of justice under the anti-destruction statutes. Her breathing remained completely synchronized with the low mechanical hum of the kitchen appliances, maintaining an absolute state of tactical readiness, while the two targets remained completely blind to the trap. The absolute silence broke when the cellular device on the table emitted a sharp, high-frequency ring, displaying the administrative routing number of the major credit card security division based in the Midwest. Ursula reached out her right index finger, pressing the speaker interface to initialize the voice channel, allowing the clear, automated notification to fill the quiet kitchen space without any obstruction. The investigator stated that the automated monitoring system had flagged a series of international luxury resort transactions originating from the Maldives, totaling exactly $24,000 for the initial operational phase. Uriah's posture API stiffened instantly, her breathing growing short and ragged as she recognized her own secondary retirement account routing designation being read aloud over the open speaker line. She adjusted her reading glasses with stiff, trembling fingers, her jaw clenching as she whispered that there must be an administrative mistake because Xavier was managing her private profiles. Ursula responded in a flat, monotone register, explaining that the forensic analysis script had already verified the system access logs, tracing the digital signature back to a specific hardware device. She stated that the metadata proved the authorization did not originate from a secure terminal in Houston, but was executed via an unauthorized remote server node during the midnight rotation. Xavier's face drained of color, his skin turning a pale gray hue, as the technical voice on the line confirmed that 3 separate retirement distributions had been processed without a physical signature. Ursula looked directly at him and spoke clearly, saying that the electronic records indicated a total loss of exactly $288,000 running through the system under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code. The systematic exposure of Xavier's operational fraud proceeded according to a strict linear progression of digital evidence screens on the synchronized tablet display that Ursula slid across the maple table. Her left thumb maintained a steady pressure on the master navigation pad to prevent the system from auto-locking the data trail, while she forced Xavier to view the incoming forensic reports. The terminal display refreshed, showing the raw metadata logs of the main server directory, where Xavier had navigated using a compromised general power of attorney file to bypass the safety protocols. Uriah stared at the glowing interface lines, her eyes tracking the exact electronic sequence where her own son had converted her long-term savings into active credit lines for his separate logistics venture. The definitive blow landed when a synchronized text archive from the device repository loaded onto the screen, displaying a direct conversation between Xavier and his brother, Xander. The text read clearly that the old woman had signed everything without keeping track of the ledger accounts, allowing him to deploy the capital into the shell firm without drawing any immediate administrative attention. Uriah covered her mouth with her left hand, her shoulders drooping by several inches as the reality of the elder financial exploitation settled into her consciousness. The document proved that Xavier had systematically treated his own mother as an unprotected asset on his balance sheet, using her identity as a blank check to fund his luxury travel while leaving her legally vulnerable to the Internal Revenue Service. Ursula pointed to the final column, showing that the systematic extraction of $24,000 multiplied by 12 months was officially flagged under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act Section 1519 for immediate federal prosecution. The kitchen fell back into a heavy, absolute quiet as the shadow of a passing cloud swept across the window pane, turning the bright amber sunshine into a cold, uniform gray. The steam from the abandoned coffee mugs rose in a straight, thin column before dispersing into the dry air, leaving the space completely devoid of any domestic warmth. Through the glass panels, the bare branches of the oak trees stood rigid against the Texas sky, a quiet landscape that matched the complete emotional detachment in Ursula's chest. Uriah looked up from the tablet screen, her face old and broken, as she stated that she would no longer support her son's defense, giving her full administrative consent to the legal actions Ursula was preparing to file. Xavier remained completely frozen by the counter-click of the automated reader, his hands dropping uselessly to his sides as the system finalized the transmission to the federal investigators. Ursula stood up slowly from the counter, her movements slow, measured, and entirely independent of the domestic parameters the Xander family had attempted to enforce on her life. She reached down and retrieved her secure storage drive from the terminal interface, knowing that the evidence of identity theft and corporate document forgery was now securely locked within a federal chain of custody. She walked down the quiet hallway toward her daughter's nursery room, her boots making a solid, rhythmic sound against the slate tiles as the system finalized the transmission. The silence that occupied her environment was massive and clean, representing the permanent removal of the Xander authority and the complete establishment of her own technical sovereignty. The cold glass of the south-facing window pane felt absolutely rigid against the pads of Xavier Xander's right fingers, sending a slow, steady chill up through the radial nerve of his arm as he stood looking down at the Houston traffic below. He stood inside the secure glass perimeter of the executive briefing room at the Houston Transport Tower, his weight shifted completely onto his left heel, feeling the polished marble floorboards beneath his boots remain perfectly static and silent under the heavy luxury rugs. The air inside the room was clean and held at exactly 18 degrees Celsius, smelling faintly of freshly treated mahogany wood and the dry paper scent of newly printed financial offering pamphlets. A thin geometric line of pristine afternoon daylight cut across the bare plaster walls, illuminating the fine dust motes hanging in the silence and casting a long, pale shadow of his tall frame across the conference desk. His left hand hung loose at his side, the muscles in his forearm still bearing the faint twitching memory of his long years spent managing logistics assets in the warm coastal sun. Outside, the steady rustle of the wind through the glass panels of the terminal created a soft, rhythmic background noise that was completely uninterrupted by the hum of transport vehicles or the loud drone of industrial ventilation systems. He kept his eyes focused on the empty boardroom tables beyond the partition, his head remaining perfectly level as he let his lungs expand in a slow, calculated cycle of breathing that made no sound in the quiet space. His fingers moved with a deliberate, microscopic deceleration as he lifted them from the glass, turning his body toward the center of the executive conference room, where the white light of the presentation screens was beginning to dissolve the lingering shadows of the room. Her husband moved his right boot forward by 3 inches, the leather creaking slightly against the grain of the floor, as he adjusted his posture to face the bright horizon of the investor list. Every muscle in his neck felt loose and unlocked, a dramatic change from the constant tension that had bound his shoulders during his final weeks inside the Vance residence. He breathed in the cool scent of the conditioned air, his mind registering the complete absence of the heavy chemical tracking products that Ursula had used to audit his movements. The pristine silence of the early hours was a physical presence in the room, comforting and absolute as he prepared to sign the final papers. This absolute physical stillness was the final audited result of a long 11-month campaign that had systematically dismantled the social and financial structures of the Xander family. Ursula Vance processed the variables of her new life with the detached, cold logic of a senior aviation quality auditor, analyzing the collapse of her former marriage as if she were reviewing a finalized asset fraud ledger from her remote monitoring terminal. The federal prosecution had executed its duties with an unyielding mechanical precision, utilizing the metadata logs and the encrypted scanner backups she had secured to completely invalidate Xavier's public defense. Xavier Xander was facing immediate indictment under the strict guidelines of Title 18, Section 1343, paving the way for a sentence of 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of bail or early parole. His brother Xavier Xander had watched his entire logistics shell firm crumble under a federal asset forfeiture order, his bank accounts seized, and his heavy transport vehicles impounded to satisfy the massive restitution demands of the court. The family's local logistics consulting network, which they had used as a commercial vehicle to route the $24,000 monthly maintenance invoices, had been officially stripped of its business registration by the Texas Secretary of State. Ursula felt no emotional triumph as she reviewed these variables. Instead, her mind cataloged the end of the litigation as a necessary system correction that had permanently purged a dangerous anomaly from her daughter's environment. The betrayal she had endured for months was no longer an active risk to be managed, but a closed case file whose administrative details were fully settled and logged. She analyzed the final assets of her recovery, noting that the court had secured 98% of the stolen funds from Xavier's frozen operational accounts. Every step of the federal investigation had unfolded in perfect alignment with her cryptographic trail, leaving the defense lawyers with no leverage to negotiate a lesser plea. The complete bankruptcy of the Xander commercial enterprise was not a personal revenge, but the inevitable mathematical consequence of their choices. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, her internal thoughts moving with a cold, smooth fluidity as she watched the last shadow of the old family name fade from her legal identity. The formal decree from the United States District Court sat displayed on the secondary terminal panel, its text declaring the absolute rescission of contract due to fraudulent inducement, without a single administrative loophole remaining. Ursula Vance reviewed the technical definitions within the judicial order, noting the explicit language that invalidated every secondary instrument the family had manufactured through identity theft and forged signatures. The legal reality was comprehensive. The court had ruled that the $288,000 phantom debt overlay was entirely void from its inception, stripping the Xander corporate estate of any residual interest in her logistics files. Her official transition to Director of Independent Quality Operations was formalized by an independent transport board granting her absolute executive authority over a private infrastructure fund exceeding $750,000. The defense counsels who had tried to corner her with settlement releases during the initial grand jury investigation had been completely excluded from the new residential perimeter of her home. Ursula recalled the physical reaction of her daughter during their final session with Dr. Melissa Green. The way the child's shoulders had dropped by 2 inches, and her breathing had become loose and light as she colored a drawing of a bright, sunlit horse. Dr. Green had explained that children from coercive households often internalize the abuser's violence as their own failure, but the systematic presentation of safety had allowed Una's neurological patterns to return to baseline health. The somatic response within her environment was clean. The automated servers registered her new credentials instantly, locking the historical access logs away from any future corporate interference. Every word written in the court final decree had validated her independent standing, ensuring that no future claim could be raised against her property. She sat in the quiet of her office, her mind reviewing the legal syntax that had permanently severed her ties to the Xander lineage, her throat completely relaxed as she let the finality of the words settle into her chest. The mechanical sequence of her final counterstrike began as Ursula reached toward the side slot of the master control dock, her movements metered, fluid, and entirely free of hesitation. Her fingers pressed the manual release button of the secondary reader unit, causing the obsolete proximity card bearing the Xander Logistics emblem to eject with a sharp click from the housing slot. She lifted the plastic token between 2 fingers, her gaze remaining fixed on the industrial shredder unit that sat integrated beneath the stainless steel framework of the central desk. Without a single backward glance, she dropped the card directly into the high-security disposal slot, listening to the instantaneous grinding of the steel blades as they reduced the final physical link of her marriage to microscopic fragments of carbon composite. Her right hand moved immediately toward the main isolation switch on the wall, her fingers engaging the mechanical lever with a firm downward pressure that permanently deactivated the legacy communication channels linking her database to the old estate servers. The terminal arrays responded with a uniform sequence of system shutdown logs, their cooling fans decreasing their velocity in a steady deceleration pattern that signaled the absolute end of the Xander parameters within her suite. She monitored the progress of the final backup, watching the digital terminal track the compression of 24 months of military logistics records into a secure, encrypted, offline storage drive. Every file was systematically indexed and locked under her private administrative password, ensuring that her professional achievements remained entirely under her personal custody. The hum of the computer fans died away completely, leaving the desk terminals dark and cold under the bright morning sun. She gathered her personal notebooks and placed them into the metal drawers of her desk, her hands executing each movement with a calm, deliberate rhythm that signaled the end of her transition. The final visualization of the system clear sequence reached completion on the central monitor, leaving the main workspace in the brilliant, shadowless glare of the mid-morning winter sun. The air within the new office remained perfectly balanced, but the heavy historical pressure that had occupied her professional life for 3 years was entirely gone, replaced by the deep quiet of independent operation. Through the thick glass panes of the exterior wall, the freezing winds of the Houston hills were throwing dry sleet against the insulated structure, but the internal heating systems maintained an absolute equilibrium that felt completely untouchable. Ursula stood alone before the console, her hands resting flat against the clean metal edge of the station, while the low hum of the active processing units faded away into the background, leaving the space in absolute silence. The freedom that occupied her workspace was massive and definitive, marking the permanent establishment of her autonomy and the complete restoration of her individual identity. She turned her face toward the expansive horizon, her movements completely light as she prepared to close the chapter on her decades of logistics service. Ursula Vance stepped out onto the wide-open porch of the corporate farmhouse, her boots clicking softly against the weathered cedar planks. She stood alone in the cool morning air, her fingers reaching into her jacket pocket to retrieve the silver military identification badge and the small red emblem of her aviation division. She placed the metallic items inside an old, empty tin box she had saved from her deployment, closing the lid with a firm, decisive snap before sliding the box into her pocket. She did not look back at the dark hallway of the house. Instead, her eyes tracked the movement of 5-year-old Una as the child ran across the green pasture, her yellow hair catching the morning sun as she chased a pair of blue butterflies. The distant, joyful sound of her daughter's laughter echoed across the open field, completely replacing the heavy, suffocating silence of the old Xander manor. The cold wind from the nearby river valley swept through the tall pine trees, carrying the fresh, clean scent of damp earth and the promise of a peaceful afternoon. Ursula let her hands rest flat against the wooden railing of the porch, her chest expanding in a deep, full breath as the shadow of the old family narrative dissolved into the bright daylight. She stood perfectly still in the quiet of her new home, her voice low and steady as she spoke her final confirmation phrase into the crisp winter morning. I have redefined the metrics of my own professional legacy, and the system now operates under my parameters. The cold glass of the touch panel terminal felt absolutely rigid against the pads of Ursula Vance's right fingers. A slow, steady chill moved straight up through the radial nerve of her arm as she stood looking out at the new transport grid below. She stood inside the secure glass perimeter of the newly constructed high-tech transportation hub terminal. Her weight shifted completely onto her left heel. She felt the polished steel plates beneath her boots remain perfectly static and silent under the heavy soundproof mats. The air inside the room was clean and held at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. The space smelled faintly of freshly treated metallic housing units. The dry, distinct ozone scent of newly operational processing servers warming up in their bays filled the environment. A thin, geometric line of pristine dawn sunlight cut across the bare industrial walls. The light illuminated the fine dust motes hanging in the silence and cast a long, pale shadow of her tall frame across the central control desk. Her left hand hung loose at his side. The muscles in her forearms still bore the faint twitching memory of her long months spent managing broken material logs under the harsh blue spectrum glare of the old base terminal. Outside, the steady rustle of the wind through the glass panels of the terminal created a soft, rhythmic background noise. This sound was completely uninterrupted by the hum of older diesel vehicles or the loud drone of legacy industrial ventilation systems. She kept her eyes focused on the empty server arrays beyond the secure partition. Her head remained perfectly level as she let her lungs expand in a slow, calculated cycle of breathing that made no sound in the quiet room. Her fingers moved with a deliberate, microscopic deceleration as she lifted them from the glass. She turned her body toward the center of the control room, where the blue light of the status screens was beginning to dissolve the lingering shadows of the room. The senior auditor moved her right boot forward by 3 inches, the leather creaking slightly against the grain of the floor as she adjusted her posture to face the bright horizon of the active system layout. Every muscle in her neck felt loose and unlocked. This was a dramatic change from the constant tension that had bound her shoulders during her final weeks inside the old residence. She breathed in the cool scent of the conditioned air. Her mind registered the complete absence of the heavy chemical masking products that Xavier had used to disguise his domestic tracks. The pristine silence of the early hours was a physical presence in the room, comforting and absolute as she prepared to initialize the final database parameters. This absolute physical stillness was the final audited result of a long 11-month campaign that had systematically dismantled the social and financial structures of the Xander family enterprise. Ursula Vance processed the variables of her new life with the detached, cold logic of a senior aviation quality auditor. She analyzed the collapse of her former marriage as if she were reviewing a finalized asset fraud ledger from her remote monitoring terminal. The federal prosecution had executed its duties with an unyielding mechanical precision. The investigators utilized the metadata logs and the encrypted scanner backups she had secured to completely invalidate Xavier's public defense. Xavier Xander was facing immediate indictment under the strict guidelines of Title 18, Section 1343. This statutory path paved the way for a sentence of 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of bail or early parole. His brother Xavier Xander had watched his entire logistics shell firm crumble under a federal asset forfeiture order. His bank accounts were seized, and his heavy transport vehicles were impounded to satisfy the massive restitution demands of the court. The family's local logistics consulting network had been officially stripped of its business registration by the Texas Secretary of State. They had previously used this network as a commercial vehicle to route the $24,000 monthly maintenance invoices. Ursula felt no emotional triumph as she reviewed these variables. Instead, her mind cataloged the end of the litigation as a necessary system correction. This outcome had permanently purged a dangerous anomaly from her daughter's environment. The betrayal she had endured for months was no longer an active risk to be managed. It was now a closed case file, whose administrative details were fully settled and logged. She analyzed the final assets of her recovery, noting that the court had secured 98% of the stolen funds from Xavier's frozen operational accounts. Every step of the federal investigation had unfolded in perfect alignment with her cryptographic trail. This left the defense lawyers with no leverage to negotiate a lesser plea. The complete bankruptcy of the Xander commercial enterprise was not a personal revenge. It was the inevitable mathematical consequence of their choices. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. Her internal thoughts moved with a cold, smooth fluidity as she watched the last shadow of the old family name fade from her legal identity. The formal decree from the United States District Court sat displayed on the secondary terminal panel. Its text declared the absolute rescission of contract due to fraudulent inducement, without a single administrative loophole remaining. Ursula Vance reviewed the technical definitions within the judicial order. She noted the explicit language that invalidated every secondary instrument the family had manufactured through identity theft and forged signatures. The legal reality was comprehensive. The court had ruled that the $288,000 phantom debt overlay was entirely void from its inception. This ruling stripped the Xander corporate estate of any residual interest in her logistics files. Her official transition to Director of Independent Quality Operations was finalized by an independent transport board. This appointment granted her absolute executive authority over a private infrastructure fund exceeding $750,000. The defense counsels had tried to corner her with settlement releases during the initial grand jury investigation. They were now completely excluded from the new residential perimeter of her home. Ursula recalled the physical reaction of her daughter during their final session with the local specialist. She remembered the way the child's shoulders had dropped by 2 inches, and her breathing had become loose and light as she colored a drawing of a bright, sunlit horse. The specialist had explained that children from coercive households often internalize the abuser's violence as their own failure. The systematic presentation of safety had allowed Una's neurological patterns to return to baseline health. The somatic response within her environment was clean. The automated servers registered her new credentials instantly. The architecture locked the historical access logs away from any future corporate interference. Every word written in the court's final decree had validated her independent standing. This protection ensured that no future claim could be raised against her property. She sat in the quiet of her office. Her mind reviewed the legal syntax that had permanently severed her ties to the Xander lineage. Her throat was completely relaxed as she let the finality of the words settle into her chest. The mechanical sequence of her final counterstrike began as Ursula reached toward the side slot of the master control dock. Her movements were metered, fluid, and entirely free of hesitation. Her fingers pressed the manual release button of the secondary reader unit. This action caused the obsolete proximity card bearing the Xander Logistics emblem to eject with a sharp click from the housing slot. She lifted the plastic token between 2 fingers. Her gaze remained fixed on the industrial shredder unit that sat integrated beneath the stainless steel framework of the central desk. Without a single backward glance, she dropped the card directly into the high-security disposal slot. She listened to the instantaneous grinding of the steel blades as they reduced the final physical link of her marriage to microscopic fragments of carbon composite. Her right hand moved immediately toward the main isolation switch on the wall. Her fingers engaged the mechanical lever with a firm downward pressure that permanently deactivated the legacy communication channels linking her database to the old estate servers. The terminal arrays responded with a uniform sequence of system shutdown logs. Their cooling fans decreased their velocity in a steady deceleration pattern. This transition signaled the absolute end of the Xander parameters within her suite. She monitored the progress of the final backup, watching the digital terminal track the data compression. The system packed 24 months of military logistics records into a secure, encrypted offline storage drive. Every file was systematically indexed and locked under her private administrative password. This step ensured that her professional achievements remained entirely under her personal custody. The hum of the computer fans died away completely, leaving the desk terminals dark and cold under the bright morning sun. She gathered her personal notebooks and placed them into the metal drawers of her desk. Her hands executed each movement with a calm, deliberate rhythm that signaled the end of her transition. The final visualization of the system clear sequence reached completion on the central monitor. This left the main workspace in the brilliant, shadowless glare of the mid-morning winter sun. The air within the new office remained perfectly balanced. The heavy, historical pressure that had occupied her professional life for 3 years was entirely gone. It was replaced by the deep quiet of independent operation. Through the thick glass panes of the exterior wall, the freezing winds of the Houston hills were throwing dry sleet against the insulated structure. The internal heating systems maintained an absolute equilibrium that felt completely untouchable. Ursula stood alone before the console. Her hands rested flat against the clean metal edge of the station, while the low hum of the active processing units faded away into the background, leaving the space in absolute silence. The freedom that occupied her workspace was massive and definitive. This step marked the permanent establishment of her autonomy and the complete restoration of her individual identity. She turned her face toward the expansive horizon, her movements completely light as she prepared to close the chapter on her decades of logistics service. Ursula Vance stood alone before the central console of the new transportation hub station. Her boots remained completely still. She slowly pulled the legacy security card of the old airfield enterprise and her former quality audit badge out of her deep coat pocket. She placed the plastic items inside a small, empty tin container she had saved from her earlier deployments. Her fingers locked the metal box with a firm, decisive snap before she spun the security key to seal the historical logistics storage locker permanently behind her. She did not look back at the dark server racks of the old division. Instead, her eyes tracked the digital readouts of the new network interface as the ambient indicators registered a flawless transmission flow across the state. The old mechanical rattle of the background mainframes died away completely. This noise gave way to the nearly silent, fluid operation of a top-tier data array, while the morning light began to fade from the terminal windows. The automated system shifted to evening operations, turning the bright neon indicator lights down to a soft, low-intensity blue spectrum that cast no glare across the room. She stood perfectly still in the pristine quiet of her new command station, her voice low and steady as she spoke her final confirmation phrase into the crisp winter morning. I have redefined the metrics of my own professional legacy, and the system now operates under my parameters. The main console lights adjusted automatically to nighttime status, leaving the room in a state of absolute motionless quiet, where the only remaining sound was the soft, regular respiration of infant Una, sleeping deeply in the carrier next to the desk.